Today is Monday, February 24th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. Massive revival going on at Ohio State University. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. You can email us as well, quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. And joining me today to get through the news of the craze we do each and every weekday here bright and early, CBN's Billy Hallowell. And Billy, coming up on the focus story, a well-known Hollywood actress is on a mission to honor God.
Yeah, Patricia Heaton, we have had her on before, had a chance to catch up with her. We'll get into what she's working on and why she believes it's essential to rely on God in her career.
All right, looking forward to the details there. On the main thing, the NIH is slashing university research grants. Heritage Foundation's Adam Kissel explains why this is necessary. That's all coming up on the main thing. All right, make sure you subscribe to all of our CBN News podcasts, including PC Debrief, Billy's Newsmakers. You can find links to those in the description of this Quick Start podcast episode, and we put them in there in each and every Quick Start podcast episode, so make sure you're checking those out. All right, and with that, we're going to head to the news in 90 seconds. A major revival swept through Ohio State University, where nearly 2,000 students committed their lives to Christ at a Unite Us event this week. Held at the Schott Sports Arena, the event drew over 6,500 students despite freezing temperatures. In a powerful display of faith, students were baptized in U-Haul trucks outside the venue. Unite Us founder Tanya Pruitt called it a move of God, saying he's just getting started. Pastor Matt Brown highlighted similar spontaneous baptisms happening on campuses nationwide. This revival follows a similar event at the University of Kentucky and a football team-led revival at OSU last year. The next Unite Us event is set for March 5th at Purdue University. And President Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is heading back to the Middle East as ceasefire and hostage talks continue. This comes after a grueling week for Israel, with 4 hostage bodies returned and 6 living hostages freed. Israel is protesting Hamas's brutality, pausing the release of 600 Palestinian prisoners after evidence emerged of murdered hostages, including a mother and her 2 children. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories over at cbnnews.com. Billy, a lot going on with Israel. A lot going on over there. Obviously, going to be ceasefire talks this week still, and we're looking into, the number of hostages. It's just ridiculous, the number of prisoners that Israel's having to release here. So that's been something of concern. One of Hamas's longest held prisoners was released, and so that is something that has to be frustrating for Israeli citizens. So we'll be covering that over at CBN News. But Billy, this news of revival at Ohio State University, we covered the football story when that was going on, when a lot of the football players were leading that. And it seems to be continuing there and at a couple other college campuses as well. And in all the chaos that's going on, that's a really positive one to see.
It is, yeah. We also had Jenny Allen on to talk about the University of Kentucky, which was the week before this Ohio event, and we're actually going to see her again this week to talk a little bit more about what else she is seeing. So, because she's one of the key speakers, with Unite Us. So it's look, I think young people are desperate for the truth, and so you're kind of watching that unfold. It kind of coincides with everything else that's happening in culture, right? And even in politics is like sort of the shift, for something new away from the status quo. And so it'll be interesting to see, hopefully this is sustained and it pushes through and we see it happen on more campuses.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, people searching for something new and really the truth. I mean, we've talked about it on this podcast, but I think so many blatant untruths have been pushed. I think it's actually, in a lot of cases, having the effect of causing people to actually seek out what is true. And as Christians, that should be an exciting prospect for us, knowing that we have the truth in Scripture. All right, we're going to head to the focus story right now. Patricia Heaton has long been a fixture in Hollywood and has spoken out on things that she believes in. And what does she believe is the key to her success here?
Yeah, it's interesting because this is somebody who's, she was on The Middle, Everybody Loves Raymond, tons of movies. And she's had probably one of the most sustained careers in Hollywood out of most actresses today. And she really believes that her key to success has really just been turning things over to God, relying on God, and putting him at the center. And we had a chance to actually talk with her in person recently at this red carpet premiere of her new movie, The Unbreakable Boy, which we could talk about in a minute. But yeah, I think just trying to keep her focus always on faith and truth.
And what did she say? You talk about turning everything over to the Lord. What did she say about the importance of doing that?
Yeah, so this was interesting because she said when you give everything over to God, he gives it back to you in a way you could never have imagined. And I thought that was an interesting quote because I do think a lot of times we have our plans, the things we want to do, and especially when you're working in Hollywood. And I mean, she's not perfect; none of us are, right? You have these dreams and visions of what you want to do. And she said, "I feel like God gave me certain gifts, and so it's my responsibility to honor him in the work." And so this idea that, we have these gifts and you look around the world, you see all these other celebrities, these people who, they have these amazing gifts and they use them to sort of honor and glorify themselves. And so, I think this notion in her life that, hey, okay, I've got these gifts. How am I going to use them or use the work that I'm doing to highlight things that are true? And you kind of see her doing this right now with the October 7th Coalition, which is her organization that supports Israel after October 7th. That the horrible attacks there. And so she's taking the fame and the projects she's done and turning them back over into outside projects that can help, honor the truth. So really just a great take to have, especially for somebody coming from Hollywood.
Yeah. And she's in a new movie called The Unbreakable Boy. So what is the premise of this one?
Yeah, this is a movie. It's out right now, and it really is worth seeing. It's a film about this family that's navigating a child's journey. Their son, he's both autistic and he has brittle bone disease. So he's got these two things going on, and the family's dealing with all sorts of struggles as they navigate that. And so she's part of that movie. And we talked a little bit about the film. She said this is a wonderful, true story. And it's a story about a struggle that many families experience today. Just, a kid on the spectrum. But I think the thing about this film that's interesting is that any struggle that a family has, they're trying to, live for the Lord. They're going through these things that, are insurmountable. They seem insurmountable. It's a film that really tackles that. And so from a broader level, I think it's one that every Christian can really take a lot away from.
And what does she believe is an important message from this film that speaks to kind of where we're at today in culture?
Yeah, the idea that we're obviously in this crazy, confused culture, and that's something she talks a lot about with her work, around Israel and all of that. But she said that this is a raw and a real story, and it's encouraging, in the chaos of the world around us with all the struggles we feel and so many people struggling with depression. And, this film deals with all, even alcoholism, and it deals with all of these things that I think are facets in people's lives, or we can at least relate to. And so I'm really just feeling like, going back to her quote about God, putting God at the center, that this is a film that actually helps people navigate some of those things. So, it's encouraging. I watched it the other day with my family, and we really, really loved it. So I'd encourage people to check it out.
Yeah. And I think that's something that we can miss in today's culture, where I feel like, the political tensions are higher than we always say higher than ever, but it feels like it because we have social media where everyone's just sharing their every thought. I mean, you got to really realize we're in like a pioneer generation here. The last 15 years or so, 20 years or so of the advent of social media, and people sharing their every thought and their every emotion at every moment. People are on these TikTok and X and Facebook, Instagram, whatever else, just sharing all of their emotions all the time. And so people frustrated at one administration or another, they're sharing that constantly. So you're feeling that more. And I think a result of that is we just miss so much of the human element of what's going on with the people actually around us. We're so fixated on our phones and what's the latest thing being said. And, oh, did you see this meme? And, oh my goodness, did you see Trump did this or Biden did that? And we're so focused on that. We miss these things that people are going through and the struggles that people have, the real life things that people have. And I think there is a yearning for that, to sort of get back to that, because, you know, a family like this that's going through this story in this movie, and, you know, to miss out on those things, we miss out on opportunities to witness to other people, to serve other people, to just kind of bear burdens with one another. We miss out on those things when we're so hyper fixated on what's going on our phones.
Yeah, no, and I think it's such an addiction, and it's so difficult, right? For everybody. I think a lot of people, they want to break away from the phone. They want to break away. They want to, you know, put their attention on, and it really is. I mean, that's the whole premise of social media in itself, is to sort of get us addicted to it, and so we're distracted, and so we have to put that effort in. It's tough, but no, I agree with everything you just said.
All right. Well, appreciate you bringing that one to the podcast today, Billy. Make sure and check that one out. Unbreakable Boy, Patricia Heaton. All right, we are going to head over to the main thing now. And the National Institutes of Health recently said that it would cut research grants to universities from an average of about 60% to 15%. The Heritage Foundation visiting fellow on higher education, Adam Kissel, talked to Madison Seals about why this needs to happen. That conversation is today's main thing.
Well, Adam, first off, what kind of research does federal grant money typically go towards at universities?
Universities engage in a very wide variety of federally sponsored research, from cancer research to animal studies to probably supporting super collider work to astronomy to psychology and political science-oriented surveys. So it's the entire research agenda of a university potentially could get federally funded.
And how is the money that's needed for a specific research project typically calculated? And is there any follow-up to examine how it's actually spent?
The federal research money that goes out to a university for a particular grant generally has two parts. There's the direct costs of actually doing the research, of putting the research instruments in the laboratory, getting the monkeys or the bunnies to stay alive in the lab, whatever it is that's directly related to the research. And then a second category is what's called indirect costs, or often called facilities and administration, which involves all the rest of the costs that are involved with a university running that lab or being able to make that lab possible at the university. So that can include keeping the lights on in the president's office, because the president might spend 3 minutes a year on that particular grant. The provost also, the dean of academics and research may, the larger administrative needs of the university to keep the policies in order, to pay for the trustees to come and oversee academic policies. All of those indirect costs are built into the overall research grant. So what happens is, it might be for every $100 of a research grant, Harvard says, well, it costs us $69 to keep that research grant going, so you should give us $169 per 100. So 100 goes to this researcher and 69 goes to these vague indirect costs. Then we don't really know what happens, because the accountant doesn't say, okay, I'm going to charge 3 minutes of the president's time to this grant and 6 minutes of the president's time to that grant. It just goes into the general fund, and it becomes a slush fund for whatever the university wants to spend it on.
Yeah, it seems to be part of the reason that the Trump administration is taking an interest in this. How could the funding cut proposed by the Trump administration affect the research capabilities of universities? Can you talk about just a little bit more about what that funding cut looks like?
Right now, as I mentioned, Harvard charges a 69% overhead rate. Yale charges 67.5%. Johns Hopkins 63.5%. The average is maybe 25 to 35%. And what happens under the current system is that if the government wants to sponsor research, it's paying for every light bulb, every minute of everyone's time to support that research. What the proposal is that if the university is going to be a real research partner of the government, the university should have its own skin in the game and at least pay to keep the lights on. And in fact, that is what universities do with the private sector. So the National Science Foundation, for instance, is willing to give universities an average overhead rate of about 27%, $27 for every 100 of direct research. But those same universities only charge about half, 14%, to the private sector. The Templeton Foundation offers a maximum of 15% for indirect costs, the Gates Foundation 10%. And so what the National Institutes of Health has done is said, you know what, we should be saving taxpayer money and just have a 15% overhead rate because the university can pay some of its own costs. Now, what that means is a much higher percentage of the money goes to the direct cost, to the actual research. Congress appropriates the same amount of money either way. So by changing the overhead rate and making it lower, more money goes into basic science, less money goes into overhead. But that also means somebody else is paying for that overhead, and it's the universities themselves. So that changes their incentives for how much government research versus private sector research they want to do.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And this research that you're talking about, the Heritage Foundation released some of that in 2022, showing just how large this discrepancy is between the money that's being received from the government and private foundations or individuals. And yet it's the same research being conducted, right?
The research under a research project is going to be the same either way. And what we're talking about are the overhead facilities and administration functions that happen outside of the lab, outside of the research. So whether the private foundation or the private sector or the government is funding the research, the same researcher does the same work. We're just talking about the things outside the lab.
Well, I think the questions that many people are asking with all of this government spending being exposed and cut by DOGE is, how could this affect the taxpayer? How does this affect all of us, those who are listening, who maybe aren't directly involved in the research, but could they be affected by this cut?
Here's how I think it would happen. So right now, universities receive about $60 billion a year in federal research grants. And let's say 25% or so of that, or 15 billion of it, is for overhead. If it turns out that Congress learns that we can get all the same research done at an overhead rate of 15% instead of 25%, that means we can get all the same research done for $5 or $6 billion less per year. And so what Congress should then do is save us $5 or $6 billion and appropriate $5 or $6 billion less for the science that the federal government is funding. What we also might find out is that whenever the government steps away, the private sector might step in to do that same research, even without the government money. Now, the commercialization of that research is a different question, but Congress might say, you know what, maybe we don't need to be funding all this research through the government, and the private sector will make better, more efficient decisions to produce the kind of research findings that will be better for Americans. So maybe we want to get out of the research game entirely, or at least partly. And that would save us, again, up to $60 billion.
Well, what are you looking to see next as far as this cut goes? Is this something that could happen very soon? Is it something that's already in the works, or is this further down the line?
Well, the National Institutes of Health already said that it's using its authority to change the overhead rate, not just for grants going forward, but also going backward to that 15%. That's being litigated right now. I believe there's a temporary restraining order stopping the NIH from doing that. And the argument is that Congress said that NIH may not change its policy in a general way like it's done. Now, whether a court says that's correct or not, that doesn't mean that the Office of Management and Budget, which oversees, from a regulatory point of view, the grant policies of the different agencies, it doesn't mean that OMB can't say government-wide, we're going to set a 15% limit. And it doesn't mean that the president is enjoined from putting out an executive order saying that government-wide it will be a 15% rate going forward. So even if NIH loses in court today, there are other ways for the government, for this administration, to get the same results. And maybe not looking backward, it's hard to renegotiate a deal that the university was counting on It could cost hundreds of millions of dollars to the top research universities that they were expecting to get, but now won't get. So it may not work to go backwards and look backwards, but it certainly is something that OMB, Office of Management and Budget, or the president could instruct every agency to do going forward. And that's what I would like to see.
All right, appreciate that conversation there. Really interesting, as there's a massive shift going on right now in how the government looks at spending, and we'll see where the dust settles. But they are certainly kicking up the dust and challenging the way things are happening right now. And so we'll see where it all lands. But certainly the status quo is something that wasn't very sustainable. The path that America is on when it comes to spending. So appreciate that conversation there, Madison. And that's going to leave us with time here on the podcast today for one last thing.
We've got Psalm 55:22. Cast your cares on the Lord and he will sustain you. Just a powerful message to start the week with, and one that we've got to keep with us each and every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep that our eyes fixed on the Lord. And that is where our hope is. That's where our trust is. That's where our rest comes from as well. So good verse there to kick off the week. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Quick Start Podcast. Make sure you're getting on over to cbnnews.com, faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. And Lord willing, and that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back here tomorrow with more. God bless. We'll see you then.